Hi and welcome to my beginner's guide for Loop Hero. I'm Icon and this video will guide you through how to win the first level and how to build up a generally successful loop in the game. I have reset the game to a pretty beginner state. I was not able to remove all the items I'm using right now, so the potions won't be with you when you start out the game, as just like this suite of armor won't be with you. These are a result of a few upgrades, so please don't mind ignoring them. We will just get started and I'll talk step by step about everything you need to know to conquer this game. So when we start out, we just have no fields plugged down at all. Every part of the map is just wasteland. Wasteland has a 5% chance of spawning a slime, and that's it. This is not the state you want your environment in. Slimes are literally the worst enemies that can spawn. They have very, very low loot yields and they never really offer you anything special. You want to get rid of them as quick as possible. So, mountain tiles are your friends. They increase your max HP, which are depicted here. Treasuries are quite nifty as well. They just give you random resources when you place something into their vicinity, but you can't place them next to something. Quite a simple mechanic. You see here, the rock will then trigger a drop. These drops give you permanent upgrades later. So we now found our first threat area. A spider cocoon is one of the most dangerous ones to begin with, because they spawn a spider every day. Luckily for us, spiders are quite squishy, but you can easily screw yourself over with plucking down too many of those things. This goes for a lot of things in this game. Be very careful with threat placement with this game, because every threat needs to be handled, and it's so easy to just place down too many threats to begin with. So we're finding now rocks. Rocks are the small cousins of mountains. They gain more HP for every adjacent piece of rock or mountain, so it's always a good idea to cluster them together. So here goes the first spider, and as you see, we found a first item with a blue background featuring attack speed. I'll talk more about those stats in a minute. So the beginning of every successful game is very random. If you make it or not, it's entirely up to RNG. There are sometimes loops that are better abandoned than played further, because sometimes you just can't rely on solid drops every single time. So we now found our grove, which spawns a red wolf every 2 days. The special of this one is that it can move between tiles, but we don't care too much about that. We just place it down. At the beginning of the game, I really like to place down as much as 4 or 5 threat squares as quick as possible to increase my loot. We found yet another treasury. I won't be placing that down right now. We found a road lantern. I want to talk about road lanterns now. Road lanterns decrease the maximum number of monsters on adjacent tiles. That means inside the radius of the road lantern, the maximum amount of monsters is reduced by 1, which is naturally a number of 4. So with the road lanterns, you can tune down fast spawning areas like spider cocoons very, very easily. This is very beneficial because this way you're able to control the threat in a certain area. Next up, we found a beacon. It increases movement speed when it's within its range, and it increases attack speed for all units. This is a very, very double-edged sword, but overall attack speed is good, but it's also working for the enemies. So I usually swap out the beacon as one of the first cards from my beginner deck. I'm using right now the complete beginner's deck. Because I feel like the effects of this are quite hard to utilize as a beginner and with a beginner's deck. Right now I don't want to place it down because, yeah, sure, movement speed can be quite handy, but I'm not too interested in it at all right now, because there's nothing bad with the passing of time, as far as I know at least. So now we found our first meadow. Meadows give you healing at the start of each day. Let's place that down next to the treasury. And if the meadow is placed right next to something which is not a meadow, it turns into a blooming meadow, which will heal you a little bit every day. So we found a cemetery which spawns a skeleton every 3 days. Skeletons are really nasty enemies because they are pretty hard hitting, and they also feature a natural damage resistance. So by placing it down next to the lantern, I am controlling the threat it does. So next up comes the battlefield. These things are mostly just beneficial. They spawn a chest at the start of each loop. So basically when we pass the camp, we get a chest. Chests are good. Chests are really just good. Battlefields have a chance to make enemies, turn enemies into ghosts. That's their downside. So you can either use them here just as a cheap generator for chests, or place them into the vicinity of these areas here where they serve two purposes. First off, they will create ghosts out of the fallen enemies, which is, well, creating a new enemy, but also creating new loot. Because with this game, it's a lot about creating threats which spawn loot for you, because if you don't have anything too threatening on the map, you won't be receiving the loot you need to finish off the boss. The boss is summoned after you have placed down enough tiles. You see here, that's the bar. So the faster you place down tiles, the faster the boss appears. But as you see here, my hand is mostly full with threat tiles, and it's never a wise choice to place down too many threat tiles while you're not able to control your loop. But how to create a loop that you can control? The answer lies mostly in your equipment after you have placed down your tiles. Right now we are in a very dire situation. As you see here, my loot doesn't get any particular big upgrades. I'm only running around with level 1 gray gear, and that's basically the worst that can happen. So since this is happening, I'm placing down one more grove, which I consider one of the least dangerous areas that are available to you. Why do I think so? Because the rat wolves have only average combat stats and they spawn every 2 days. Whereas the spider cocoon spawns daily, but a spider has way less HP, so it's pretty hard to generalize things like these because the game has a lot of mutators and differences, and every time the enemy level increases, like you see, this does change the enemy's behavior as well. So we found our first pieces of level 2 gear. So from this part of the video on, I will talk more and more about gear, because that's now the next thing we are thinking about. So when you want to go for your gear, there are a few rules of thumb that always apply. First off, damage first. Seriously. Damage is by far the most important stat I've found right now in the game, especially when you're playing a warrior, because the best way of preventing damage is by killing enemies as fast as possible, and therefore if you have a low damage, every other stat will not be as effective as it would be with a higher damage. After that, regen per sec is a very powerful stat in the early game, because it works all the time for you. No matter if you're in combat or not, if you're just traveling around, it always keeps healing you up. And that's why I really like to have regen per sec as an early game stat. Later down the road, vampirism overshines regen per sec, but vampirism only gives you a certain percentage of the dealt damage as healing. And, you know, if your total damage is low, percentage stats are always not too desirable. So as a rule of thumb, the first 5 enemy levels I value regen per sec way over vampirism, and after that we can start valuing vampirism more. But it really depends on your setup. After that, the next stats I want to talk about are damage to all and magic damage. These are very powerful stats, and I consider them as the next important thing after your regen per sec. Why do I think so? Damage to all is acting in 2 ways. It not only gives you AoE damage, but it also increases your single target damage, because damage to all is also applied to the direct damage. And also 3-on-3 rocks or mountains create a mountain peak which spawns harpies and increases your HP a lot. So without damage to all and magic damage, you will suffer 2 things. First up, your damage will be very hard to increase because the game tends to not reward you a weapon every time, because that's quite simply explained. You have 4 equipment slots. That means whenever a item is rolled, you have only a 25% chance of acquiring a weapon and 75% chance of acquiring something else. So it's already in the numbers that your weapon slot will often stay behind. Damage to all and magic damage negate that, because they can give you a certain upgrade for your damage way before you get lucky enough to find a new weapon. But there's another thing I want to mention. Damage to all is very, very beneficial in situations like these, where you have several enemies at once. And magic damage counters a lot of damage resistances of your enemies. So skeletons and ghosts, for example, have a very high natural damage resistance, which is, well, as far as I've noticed it, being completely ignored by magic damage in general. So if you find magic damage on shields, rings, armors, use it. It's a very, very powerful stat, and I value it directly after regen per sec for the warrior. After that, things get a little bit more obscure. I personally like to think it like that. As soon as my damage and my regen are good enough, I want to focus into some kind of either vampirism or more regen, whatever happens first. And then it's up to you to decide what kind of items you get drafted most. Counter and evasion are very, very powerful stats, but I personally consider them luxury stats, which should never be focused before your damage and your sustain. If you start focusing these stats before your damage and your sustain, most of the time I fell completely flat while trying that, because I was not able to sustain through the relentless attacks of my enemies. You can counteract that, though, with the usage of other cards later down the road, because you won't be stuck with these options forever. The game offers you a lot of different options, because after all, it is a deck builder, so we will be talking about that in a minute. So another road lantern appeared, and now we're going to plug them in here, and whenever I have a network of a few more road lanterns installed, now I think it's a good moment to install the beacon. 20% attack speed. Oh my god, I didn't talk about attack speed. I'm sorry, guys. Attack speed, of course. Attack speed lies somewhere between all these lines. Attack speed directly translates into more damage. Therefore, it is a damage stat. So the nasty thing about attack speed is, on its own, it doesn't deal damage. So personally, I would put attack speed after damage to all and magic damage, then attack speed, and then again the new sustain things. If you keep that order, vampirism will always matter, because vampirism uses all the damage numbers here. As far as I've realized, damage to all and magic damage get counted in for your vampirism stat, but vampirism without a high base damage is pretty useless. So that's why I always go for these first. So I'm going to talk about traits now too, even though you will have to unlock a certain building before you can acquire them. So if you're not there yet, feel free to ignore that for now. Also, empty treasuries spawn gargoyles, so be careful with them to not spawn too many of them. But it also gives you a boatload of new items. So let's give me a sec. Attack speed, counter evasion. So this is, for example, I won't be exchanging any of those because I don't want to swap out, well, the ring I could be swapping out, but I don't want to give away my regen per sec. Because as you see here, my HP are just very, very stable. Alright. So, perks. About the perks, it's really easy to decide. I personally value every perk that gives you a stun chance a lot. Basically, every perk that gives you either a stun chance or a heal are, for me, very, very prioritized, because stun translates into less damage, because a stunned enemy won't be attacking you, therefore your regen per sec is more effective, your vampirism is more effective. That's just good things happening here, so I won't be exchanging that armor, for example. Also, max HP. Max HP are mostly important for the boss fight. Before that, of course, don't ignore your max HP. by all means, it is a important stat, but you can handle lower max HP without any trouble. So where was that other... I did have another treasury. Well, whatever. You won't be needing insane amounts of max HP to begin with, but you will want to increase them. You do want to increase them as soon as you go closer towards the boss fight, because with the boss fight, it's all about your long breath, I'd say. So here I'm preferring vampirism over damage to all, because we have some attack speed on it as well. Here we go. It's a hard choice, and it's almost never easy to make clear decisions. And don't worry if you have to think about things quite often or quite a lot. That's what your pause mode is for. And if you're in doubt about an upgrade, if you should do it or not, because you think like, it's doing this, but this would be like this, most of the time you're sitting in front of a quite even deal. Don't overthink these things too much. Very powerful upgrades are most of the time very clear to see. Okay, so I'd say that was enough about gear. That was a pretty lengthy part about gear, but there's just so much to talk about gear. So, last thing... No, not the last thing. Next thing I want to talk about is tile placement and its specialties. You already saw the mountain peak. You already noticed that the treasury was interacting. Here with the battlefield, if you put two battlefields against each other, if there is a area that is under influence of two battlefields, that's the precise statement, it turns into a blood path. The game is full of these little hidden interactions. Use them, learn them, and most importantly, feel free to experiment around with them and explore the game while doing so, because this is really, for me, one of the most fun parts about this game. Oh, I didn't talk about defense at all. Whoopsie, I knew I forgot something. Defense is a very average stat which just flat out reduces the damage of your enemies. It's important by all means, but I always felt like extra defense was never worth the direct focus in my attempts of beating the game, because I fared always better and more effective if I focused the already mentioned stats. But by all means, don't neglect defense at all. Like, a high value shield is always good. So, about the tile placement, I already mentioned all I wanted to mention, because everything else would be a heavy spoiler. I feel like I already spoiled enough about this. So last but not least, I want to talk about the boss fight and how I think you should initiate and win it. So, or well, no, let's stay with the tiles before we go into the boss fight. Every tile has pretty much a downside, except for a few things, like meadows, for example. Meadows are practically the only beginner tile you'll be served that has really no downside. The other tiles, if we check them out in detail, mountains will create new goblin camps. Every 10 mountain and rock tiles we will receive a goblin camp. The other threat generating tiles, they go without saying, they always generate some sort of threat. The beacon is a threat in itself, and a lot of other resources later down the road in the game will always pose some downside in addition to their benefits. Keep that in mind, this game loves double-edged swords. So, what do we have here? Oh, that's a particular good one. So here I'm opting out for the region per sec because I want the damage. And because of that, be careful with your tile placement, learn from it. And when you feel like you've made too many mistakes in a run, it's always a good idea to run back to the camp and hide in there and go home with your treasures, because if you would die, you will lose 70% of your haul, and that would be a shame. For example, here I notice my damage is really not high enough. That's mostly because I for sure made some horrible decisions while I was talking too much. So, last but not least, I will now talk about the boss, and then we go into the encampment. Boss encounter will be spawned when you have triggered that bar completely. When to fight that boss and how to fight that boss. I always go for that boss fight the moment I realized that the loop is going super crazy easy because of my perks were really good, my gear was really good, and I'm just smacking the enemies while my HP are full most of the time. That's a very, very good moment to rush the boss fight. Here are a few tips though to beat the boss of stage 1 easier. The boss of stage 1 will stage around your cozy camp, and he will transform every single tile around the cozy camp, including the roads, to something which benefits him. Oblivion cards are erasing tiles or monsters from a road. Save a few of those if you can. They are really, really good to use them in the boss fight, but also Oblivion cards, I really love to use them for goblin camps, for example, because these threat generators are also worth your Oblivion cards. Then, if you struggle with the boss, which is quite okay if you do, potions can help you. I'll explain you later how to use potions and how to upgrade them once we go into the camp. Potions are really good friends for you, and apart from that, if it still doesn't work, just upgrade your encampment more. The boss fight grows easier and easier the further you go down the road. Don't worry if you seem to be not able to beat the boss at first. It's either you not being lucky as heck with your gear, or you just don't have enough upgrades, or both. I think the boss is easily beatable if you're just having a very, very lucky run and you're already pretty experienced with the game. So that's about that. Let's go into the encampment. I don't want to spoil too much about the boss, because first off, there's not too much to say about the first one, and also I feel like this is a place where you can acquire your own success feeling. Okay, so buildings in the encampment. I always valued these here a lot. So field kitchen, I really think that's an important one because it increases the campfire's healing power. That's more healing per loop. That lowers the pressure on the necessary regeneration on your items. The herbalist's hut goes into a similar venue. It gives you the access to potions. Potions are, to begin with, very weak. 4% of your max HP, only 3 of them, and you only get 2 of them back at the beginning of each loop, but they will grow stronger. More of that in a minute. The gymnasium is very, very important because it unlocks the traits. Really go for it as quick as possible. You see it's linked to the field kitchen and the herbalist's hut. I consider it as a vital improvement on your way. And the cemetery is also pretty strong, but only after you upgraded it. Before that, it only gives you extra resources while passing the areas, and not much more than that. I'll talk about that in a minute. The smithy is the last thing I used, but I didn't really like it that much. I felt like these were the most important things. After that, you will need a lot of extra resources. Possibly the farms. The farms are also worth mentioning because they give you a new way of healing yourself. So, let's talk about these things a little bit more in detail. The gymnasium also unlocks the village card, which is very powerful. Here you see a farm in action, creating those fields. Every building that has this icon here can be upgraded. So the herbalist's hut increases the potion's healing effect and the amount of potions to carry with you. I want to point that out because I feel like this is one of the easiest ways to improve your chances of beating the boss. When you have all 5 potions or more in your inventory and you have a higher amount of healing, that just gives you way more resilience against the boss. It makes it a lot easier. The gymnasium upgrade unlocks just a new card, not that important. The field kitchen increases more campfire healing power, which is very useful if you struggle with that. But the cemetery will revive you 1 time during an expedition if you die with 15% HP. This is such a powerful thing that if you're able to pull it off somehow, do it as quick as possible, but acquiring the resources might be not that easy. So, last but not least, I want to talk about the deck construction for the warrior. This whole video is based around your first character class. Other strategies apply as soon as you go for a different class. So, like I mentioned before, I really like to opt out of the beacon as fast as I can because I really didn't feel the big benefit from that. I went rather for the villages, which give you a healing when you enter them, and also a quest, which will enhance a monster on the map. Together with the wheat fields, which will increase the healing amount of the villages, they make a very, very potent combo. Wheat fields also spawn scarecrows, which are, as far as I see it, very, very chill enemies to beat in the early game, and I really like them. So the Treasury is one thing I opt out quite often as well, because I consider it a greed item. If you want to progress resource-wise, it's a very powerful thing. But if you don't mind the resources, and if you want to be a little bit more powerful, I'd strongly recommend you to go for something else. Chrono crystals are quite cool because you can just double the effect of a day's passing on adjacent tiles. What does that mean? Most of the time with your beginner deck you don't have too many options for that, but they combine very well with meadows. But most importantly, they are quite harmless. You should not drop them right next to threat generators, because, you know, doubles the effect. But right next to meadows, which heal you per day, you can create very harmless side areas alongside of the road, which are quite beneficial. The Blood Grove is one of my personal favorites because it creates beatable enemies that offer insanely good loot. The Swamp is a little bit more dangerous, but only because it counters your healing effects. But they turned into damage. But the mosquitoes spawning here are very squishy and easy to kill, so I'd personally say it's up to your taste. My personal deck, which I used to kill the boss the first time, was this one, but I personally just felt I had a very lucky run. So I hope that was kind of helpful for you friends, to give you a few ideas how to beat the game and how to optimize your gear. All these things are just rules of thumb. No absolute truths are existed in a game with so many variables like a roguelike made that well. So sometimes, if you feel like a weird strategy might work, by all means try it. Don't nail yourself too much to one meta knowledge, to one strategy, because most of the fun in this game derives around combining things, trying out new things, discovering something while trying out something. That's where a lot of fun lives at. Alrighty, enough of that. Leave me a comment down below if you feel like there was a question that you have on your mind, or if you feel like there's something you should have mentioned, Icon, it's like this. Please feel free to add knowledge, because this is not a competition. I'm really happy if we just accumulate a lot of useful knowledge for new beginners of the game. And of course, the usual things. A like helps a lot for this video to be more visible, and a subscription to my channel helps me a lot to create more and more content like this. So if you want to support this project, and if you like the video, maybe you want to press that subscription button. And most importantly, have a lot of fun with Loop Hero. If you haven't played it yet, maybe you want to buy it. But have a nice day. See you soon.